The field is set for November.
Welcome the next Vice President of the United States, Tim Walz.
I officially accept your nomination to be Vice President of the United States of America.
Scripps News takes a closer look at both sides of the ballot and what each side needs to clinch the White House. Scripps News reports the presidential tickets.
Hard to believe, but we are now just weeks away from the first votes being cast in the 2024 presidential election. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Scripps News Reports. I'm Lauren Magarino in Atlanta. Voting by mail kicks off on September 6th in North Carolina. Alabama follows less than a week later, with more states joining before the month of September ends. The candidates are preparing for their first debate set for early September. President Joe Biden's decision not to run again has shaken up this race and the Democrats' chances of winning. Vice President Kamala Harris is now ahead of or tied with former President Donald Trump in 6 of the 7 battleground states, according to the Cook Political Report. Based on that polling, if it were to hold, Harris would win 297 electoral votes, making her president. But like that old saying goes, every week in presidential politics is like a year, and these are polls, not votes. So let's break down what is happening. First up, the perfect panel. Stephanie Liebergen is at the White House. Our Deputy Political Director, Joe St. George, is with us too, as is Mallory Newell, Vice President of Polling at Ipsos. Mallory, I want to start with you because a moment ago we saw how Harris has begun surging past Trump in almost all of these battleground states. How does that square with what you're finding in your polling?
Thanks for having me today. Yeah, that certainly, you summed it up really well. You know, the vibe has shifted. There's a growing enthusiasm among Democrats, but this remains a very close race, both nationally and in battleground states across the country.
All right. Well, Joe, you've been tracking this campaign. How has Vice President Harris shaken it up?
Well, how about a 4-letter word? Base. The base of the Democratic Party. That is dramatic. That is what has dramatically changed ever since Vice President Harris became the Democratic nominee. Yes, if you listen to Mallory and other pollsters, this is still a coin flip election, right? But the base has been energized ever since Vice President Harris became the top of the ticket in ways that it just wasn't under President Joe Biden. We weren't seeing arenas filled. Some of these rallies are feeling like Taylor Swift concerts with wrist bracelets and posts on social media, a level of excitement, again, that we just haven't seen. And I spoke with a few Democratic lawmakers this week who told me that Democrats can't win national elections without their base being enthused. Now, they can't win elections with only their base. They need undecided, moderates, independent voters too, but they need the base. And we've seen young people under the age of 30 in particular, young women under the age of 30 in particular, based on these polling, as well as black voters be mobilized in ways that they just weren't before. And real quickly, the other demographic that I think has dramatically shifted is this term that was very popular for the first 6 months of this year, and that is the term double hater, the voter who hated Trump and hated Biden. We've seen a bit of an erosion of the double hater now that it's Harris and Trump, more Democrats uniting around Harris in ways that they just weren't uniting around President Biden.
Interesting. Well, I mean, to that point, Stephanie, let me call on you because President Biden has said he's going to help Harris in any way that, she really needs during her campaign. How exactly is that going to pan out? Is that something that could actually help her campaign or maybe even hurt it, given what Joe was saying that before, the base wasn't as energized and now it's all eyes on her? What does he do?
Well, President Biden made it pretty clear when he ended his campaign that it wasn't about his lack in his own confidence and his own ability to lead, but it was about uniting the party. And so President Biden stepping aside did indeed unite the party, as Joe was just talking about. The party quickly and nearly unanimously came behind Vice President Harris. Fundraising for Democrats has been record-breaking. Volunteers help supporting the campaign have skyrocketed. The polls are trending in the direction of Vice President Harris. And so all of this support is really the momentum that she needed, that any candidate would need, to really kick off their campaign. But the president really seemingly giving the vice president the space that she needed to reestablish herself and reintroduce herself to voters as the person who deserved to be on the top of the ticket.
So, Mallory, we talk about, all right, everybody kind of filed in line in the Democratic Party after this change. The base is energized, but really this all boils down to issues. So what issues are top of mind for voters, given your research? And what are winning issues and losing issues for Harris right now?
That's a great question. And we know from our research that the candidate that's strongest on the main issue has a significant advantage. And that's been the case historically, too. The main issue continues to be the economy, which right now former President Trump does have an advantage on. So the fundamentals, despite the momentum working in Harris's favor, the fundamentals like the main issue, like presidential approval as well, are still giving a slight nod to Trump. And I think Stephanie's right. You know, President Biden has been supportive, but also giving Vice President Harris space. And I think, you know, if you look at some of those fundamentals, namely the fact that his approval rating is still quite low in the low 30% range, you know, right around 40%, that's going to be a headwind that Vice President Harris does need to overcome, in addition to showing that she's strong on the economy. And frankly, Democrats are kind of looking at many, many different issues, from the economy to immigration to, you know, foreign conflict and the situation in Gaza to even crime and safety. And so I think she's got a lot to do to kind of tackle multiple issues all at once.
All right, Joe, I want to close with you because we've talked a lot about Harris, and she's been all over the campaign trail. Not a lot of Trump. He's been doing interviews, some press conferences at Mar-a-Lago in Florida. What is his campaign strategy to stop Harris's momentum?
Well, it was a dramatic shift. I was at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. They were all but measuring for the curtains in the Oval Office. It was a confident group of conservatives. It was a confident campaign coming out of their convention. And then, boom, everything changed with President Biden dropping out of the race. So what we've been seeing in recent days and weeks is former President Trump attempt to basically, how do you go up against this new team of Harris walls? He's to some degree copy and pasting a lot. And you can say that the Biden administration was also the Harris administration. Is that tactic going to work? He's trying to compare and contrast his media appearances with Vice President Harris as not being able to. She hasn't done many interviews or hardly any major interviews since becoming the nominee. So former President Trump's out there doing press conferences and interviews as well. Those are the attempts. I think the big question, though, in conclusion, is this a personality election? Is this an issues election? If it's a personality election, it's the race for the Trump campaign to define Vice President Harris before Vice President Harris defines herself to the American people.
All right, Stephanie Lieberman, Joe St. George, and Mallory Newell. Thank you all. Appreciate it. Let's get out of Washington and into some of the communities we cover across America. John Kosick is in Cleveland, Ohio. Charlie Keegan is in Kansas City, Missouri. And Paul LeGrone is in Tampa. They are political reporters with Scripps News. John, I want to start with you because Donald Trump won the presidential vote in Ohio in both 2020 and 2016. But Barack Obama carried the state in 2012 and 2008. So what impact has Vice President Harris had on polling in the state so far?
Well, because Donald Trump did win it twice, the last two times by 8 points, there really hasn't been much of a focus on Ohio this time around. The one poll that we did see was immediately post-Biden, and it showed that Donald Trump still had a significant lead over Harris in the state. But the one thing we're seeing in the state is something that Joe St. George was just talking about, enthusiasm. Enthusiasm with the Democratic base that wasn't there a couple of weeks ago. And while Ohio is a state of 88 counties, Democrats really focus on about a dozen of them around the core areas of Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati, Dayton, and Toledo. In order to win the state, you got to drive the numbers out in those counties to offset the Republican majority in the rest of the state. And so that's really important that to have that base excited. So I'm curious to see what kind of polling does come out, if any does. I don't think she's going to make it a race in the state based on Donald Trump's success in the past, and because J.D. Vance is now on the ticket, but it could have a big impact, of course, on some of the key congressional races. There are two Democrats that are defending seats that are toss-up districts. And of course, as everyone knows, we have a big Senate race here in the state with Sherrod Brown looking for a fourth term as he goes up against Republican Bernie Moreno.
Absolutely. Well, Charlie, Missouri has backed the Republican candidate in recent elections, and Trump won the state in both 2016 and 2020. After Harris entered this race, I mean, what reaction have you seen, not even just among Democrats, but also Republicans lining up against her?
Republicans remain incredibly confident that Donald Trump will win the state of Missouri. They think that this is a solidly red state and that Donald Trump is the best choice for the people of Missouri. And really, the Republicans I've talked to are really kind of shooing Harris off as if it's not even a big threat to the state of Missouri. They remain incredibly confident that the Republicans will pull off a victory here. Donald Trump won by more than 15 points, I believe, in the last 2 elections. And they hope to carry that forward with a lot of the rural area coming out to show support for Donald Trump, and the main cities, kind of like in Ohio, supporting the more left Democrat side of the ticket.
Paul, Florida has been trending Republican in recent years. Trump, for example, won the state by a few points in 2020, and Republicans won all statewide offices by at least 10 points in the 2022 midterms. What path does Harris have, if any, to change that dynamic in her favor?
Well, if you look at the recent polls, there was a poll that came out from Florida Atlantic University just this week that showed that Trump is leading Kamala Harris by 3 points. The margin of error in that particular poll was 3 points among 1,000 likely registered voters. The big question is, and of course there are other polls that show Trump is ahead by 7 or 8 points, will the Democratic National Party spend actual money and time in this state, and will Team Harris campaign in Florida, and will those frequency of events happen leading up to November? That is yet to be seen so far. I mean, I would argue North Carolina is now more of a battleground state than perhaps Florida, but Florida's a big prize. I mean, 30 electoral votes, 23 million people, up from 29 electoral votes to 30 now. So it's a big prize, and it does certainly give you a path to victory if you win. The question is for Kamala Harris and her team, is it worth it for her to spend the kind of time and money it would take in the next less than 3 months to make up for anywhere from 3 points to 7 or 8 points, depending on which polls you believe in.
All right, and we're working on a truncated timeline here with the change-up. Paul, also, there are now 1 million more registered Republicans in Florida than Democrats. It's the largest Republican majority there since the 1980s. So what issues are driving more voters to back Republicans in the Sunshine State?
Yeah, I think the same issues we've heard. Economy. I mean, every day here at our station, we're doing stories connecting with our local viewers about issues they're talking about, the cost of insurance, home insurance, our vulnerability this hurricane season. Debbie just proved that, all it takes is a Category 1 and people are flooded out of their homes. And some of those folks were told they didn't need flood insurance, and so they dropped their flood insurance, and now they have no way to pay for their home, and it's probably going to bankrupt some of those homeowners. So the cost of living, home insurance, which has skyrocketed in this state, in part because of our vulnerability to hurricanes, but also just everyday pocketbook issues, the inflation that the whole country is dealing with. And I would argue other things like education. A lot of our schools here are not staffed. You have teachers leaving. We're one of the lowest ranked in terms of teacher salary. So that's been a big issue on the local level. I would say that this whole thing about Florida turning red, I think that cake has been getting baked for decades. It didn't happen overnight. You haven't had a democratically elected governor in Florida since Lawton Chiles in 1994. That's 30 years. So basically for 3 or more decades, you've had a Republican at the top calling the shots in Florida, setting the political agenda, infusing money into the state, and that power structure has sort of trickled down, and I think is translated obviously to the state legislature and permeated the entire state, and the Democratic Party has really had to take a back seat for about 30 years. In fact, this is the first time that they're running a candidate in every congressional district, in every legislative seat. They haven't done that in 30 years. So it's something that's been happening slowly but surely in the state of Florida.
Yeah, as they say, nothing happens in a vacuum. Well, thank you all, John Kosick, Charlie Keegan, and Paul Agrone. Appreciate all of you for joining us. And next, the strategy. What does each side need to do to secure that win? We're asking people with firsthand experience and a report from Congress. What does support look like for either candidate's agenda? This is Scripps News Reports, the presidential tickets. Vice President Kamala Harris surging in polling as we near the casting of the first ballots in this presidential election. What does she need to do to keep momentum going in her favor? And how does former President Trump stop her? Maya Rupert ran Democrat Julian Castro's 2020 presidential campaign and was an advisor to Elizabeth Warren in her campaign. She now hosts the When We Win with Maya Rupert podcast and writes the Substack power breakers. Matt Terrell was chief of staff to Republican Marco Rubio's presidential campaign and was a former special assistant to then RNC Chair Reince Priebus. And Kyle Kondik is with us, too. He is the managing editor at Sabato's Crystal Ball. Thank you all for joining us. Maya, I want to start with you because we talked in the last segment about how Harris is now tied or ahead of Trump in 6 of the 7 battleground states. How does she maintain momentum here?
I think they keep doing exactly what they've been doing. They are seeing across the country, what we've seen is an outpouring of support. That support is translating into organizing, door knocking. They're already really running that kind of a campaign, so they need to keep that up. And then I think the second piece of it is people want to know what she's going to do. She's going to get a chance to lay out her agenda. And already we're seeing talk of her starting to roll out policy proposals, really going after price gouging, which is a huge issue for Americans across the country. So I think what they do is exactly what they had been doing, taking that overwhelming support and translating it into organizing and votes and making sure that the public knows exactly what she is about through her speeches and through her policy proposals. I think we're going to see a lot more of that in coming weeks. And frankly, I think what we've seen from Donald Trump is that he doesn't have an answer to that.
Well, Matt, let me tap you in here. If you were running the Trump campaign, what would you advise him to do right now? Is what he is doing at this moment working?
Well, look, if you're running this campaign, I think you focus on the policies, particularly the economy, inflation, immigration, and crime. Those are the core issues that are going to drive this election. So focusing less on personalities and how many people are attending campaign rallies, focus away from that and narrow in on those core issues that are going to decide this election. Look, the GOP base, they're in lockstep with former President Trump. They're going to turn out for him. The Democrat base, they're going to turn out for Vice President Harris. This can come down to about 100,000 voters, give or take, in places like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. Those are swing voters. They're not committed yet to either one of these candidates. They care about the economy, inflation, border security, crime. That's what they care about. Keep talking about those policies and how you're going to make their lives better on those issues over the next 4 years. That's the key to his pathway to success.
And we'll see if that's something that he would be doing moving forward. Kyle, September will be the month of presidential debates. How much impact do you think they will potentially have on public opinion for those, swing voters or undecided voters?
People in political science like myself will sometimes just sort of downplay everything and say, oh, well, debates don't matter, or this doesn't matter, and that doesn't matter. But, we arguably just had the most impactful presidential debate ever because it literally led to a candidate leaving the race. It was also, the earliest presidential general election debate ever. And so, we can't necessarily assume that the debate will be important, but it certainly could be. I think we're probably still in the midst of a little bit of a honeymoon period for Kamala Harris. And, conventions can often lead to kind of a bounce for the candidate. So one of the things that I'm really curious about is, does Harris get a bounce out of the upcoming Democratic convention? Maybe she kind of already got it by naming a running mate and also just by the fact of becoming a candidate. At this point, I think you look at the numbers broadly, and I think you basically would say that this race is back into being a toss-up. I think if Harris were to sort of move up a level after the DNC, she might, be favored by Labor Day, and then there would be maybe twists and turns to go. But I think it is reasonable to think that this election is going to be really close to competitive. In some ways, it's sort of the end of the Trump trilogy, 2016 and 2020, now 2024. The through line there is Trump's been on the ballot all 3 times.
Maya, 30 seconds here if you can. Harris has been criticized for not doing sit-down interviews with the press from the Trump campaign and others on the Republican side. Now she's preparing for these debates. How do you think she will respond to attacks from President Trump on issues like the border and the economy, which matter to voters?
I think she's going to respond with the policy proposals that we're already seeing or talking about. I think that when it comes to policy against policy, Kamala Harris has an awful lot to say to Donald Trump. And I think it's the reason that Trump tends to go back to personal attacks rather than focusing on policy.
All right, Maya Rupert, Matt Terrell, and Kyle Kondik. Appreciate your time and your insight. Thank you. Next, inside Congress, we are tracking each candidate's chances of getting their agenda passed.
Welcome back to Scripps News Reports. I'm Nathaniel Reed outside the U.S. Capitol. What happens in the building behind me next year is going to depend on which party wins the White House in November. But if it's anything less than a clean sweep of the White House and Congress, that could make actual legislating much more difficult. Presidential candidates tend to make bold statements about their agenda.
When I am President of the United States and Congress passes a bill to restore reproductive freedoms, I will sign it into law.
Seniors will not pay taxes on Social Security.
But there's only so much that presidents can do without their party's control of Congress. And one party holding the White House, Senate, and House of Representatives could mean major shifts in U.S. policy toward the left or the right. Former President Trump says he wants to implement large tax cuts, remove taxes on Social Security benefits, and finish construction of a border wall. If Harris wins and Democrats win control of Congress, Democrats haven't ruled out making changes to the filibuster, making legislation easier to pass with a simple majority, 51 votes.
If you are, in fact, Majority Leader and Harris is elected, will you renew your push to remove the legislative filibuster?
Look, there are lots of things we want to get done. I'm not going to speculate into the future, but we are going to have as productive, even a more productive 2 years.
Lowering the 60-vote threshold by which most legislation is passed could dramatically change how the Senate operates for decades to come. And key Democratic policies could be enacted. Abortion could be legalized nationwide, voting rights could be expanded, and universal background checks on gun buyers could be implemented, all with 51 votes. But with divided government shutdowns, presidential vetoes, and high-profile standoffs between the president and Congress could be in store. Reporting from just outside the U.S. Capitol, I'm Nathaniel Reed. Lauren, back to you in Atlanta.
Nate, thank you. We will bring you the developments as they happen, and we'll keep our focus on the agendas of these two leading candidates. For now, in Atlanta, I'm Lauren Magarino for Scripps News Reports.